What if we could redesign everything? Welcome back to the Diff this year, where the world's largest online festival of ideas. My name is Seb, and I'll be your host for the next 30 to 45 minutes. And today we're talking about plastics, a topic that has, needless to say, received plenty of media and public attention in recent months and years. But today we're taking a slightly different angle on that. I'm joined by two chemistry experts who admittedly have abandoned or are attempting to abandon chemistry. Michael Shaver from the Green Materials Lab at University of Edinburgh and Mike Werner, Safe Chemistry Lead at Google. But before we get to them, the most important people in this session are you. And what we really want is to challenge the mics today or this evening or this morning, this afternoon, depending where you are, with your questions, your comments, your perspectives, because we've got them here for the next 30 to 45 minutes and they can't get away. So send in your questions and comments, and you can do that really in three ways. You can use the comment and question space, which is on the right-hand side of the video stream at thinkdiff.co. You can use the same comment and question space if you've already navigated to YouTube and you're watching us directly via YouTube, or you can tweet us using hashtag thinkdiff. So get those questions, comments in, and we'll be posing those to our guests. So joining me in the studio is Michael Shaver, and joining us virtually from California is Mike Werner. Mike Werner, why is chemistry an interesting gateway to be taught? Why have we got two people with a background in chemistry talking about plastics?
Yeah, so chemistry is a passion of mine, and I know of Mike as well. And I think for a lot of people, when they think about chemistry, they think of a problematic past class that they had and the difficulty either in high school or secondary school or in college. And I like to think of chemistry as one of the most fundamental sciences, which it is, and exciting sciences for life. For me, chemistry is actually governed by physics. And when you have this magical dance between electrons, protons, and neutrons, these fundamental building blocks, they start to connect together and form different elements. And then when you have these different elements interacting with each other, you get chemistry. And the magic of chemistry is that when you get lots of these atoms interacting with each other, you start to form systems that result in biology, result in life. So chemistry really is life.
So for the rest of the session, we're going to call you guys Shaver and Werner, just for my ease of comfort. Sure. We had earlier today we had a speaker from Solvay, and he basically said chemistry is the key to everything in recycling. Is that right?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's like when you think about that base of chemistry being the foundation for all molecules, all matter. You then think about plastics and what you're going to break that down into. And so I think that chemistry very much provides the foundations, the building blocks for life, but then also the building blocks for the plastics we use. And so if you're looking at plastics as either a great thing or a bad thing, you fundamentally have to understand the chemistry of those plastics, because you have to understand what goes into them, what are the bonds that are used to form those plastics, why do different plastics behave in different ways, and therefore you understand the processes that would be both making and then breaking those plastics down, if it's through a recycling process, which would be reprocessing, or if it's through a different mechanism, which might be more sustainable.
And I mean, to sort of unpick what you said there, I mean, some of that stuff's obviously things that people like me, who were probably in Mike Werner's category of abandoning chemistry after high school, even during high school, really. For a lot of people, the issue of plastics really comes down to something as simple as maybe they've watched Blue Planet 2 or consumed a lot of the recent coverage of plastics, and that's bad. Plastics are bad. We don't want plastics. Is that right?
I think the first thing to think of is that there are challenges with plastics, but to say plastics are bad is probably diminutive. The reason being is that what we have to consider is what the alternative materials are. I asked for 2 cups of water, not because I'm thirsty, but because I think it's important to understand where materials come from. And so it would be a choice for me to drink out of a styrofoam cup or to drink out of a ceramic mug. But if I'm making that choice from a perspective of the molecules that are going into it and the amount of energy I expended to make those two things, it becomes really clear which one I should use. And that's actually the one made of plastic. And this is because when you break that down, it'll actually take the energy of 500 styrofoam cups to be able to make my ceramic mug. Because this ceramic mug is made of clays, we've got to get that clay. We have to fire a kiln up to a very high temperature. We make a very heavy mug. We then transfer that heavy mug to the store, and we transfer that heavy mug to our homes. And then that's taking so much more energy than what is an extremely efficient process to be able to make a styrofoam cup. And the efficiency in terms of energy is really what's lost when people just think about plastics as being, the bane of our existence. We've got to think about the holistic system from the beginning to the end of the life cycle.
And does that hold true if I have that mug for 20 years and use it over and over again, and the styrofoam cup doesn't perhaps survive as long? Is that picture still?
So, well, it depends on how much of a bohemian lifestyle you lead. So if you want to, let's say, wash that cup, right, and you want to wash that in hot water and use detergent, then you're already over the energy cost of a styrofoam cup. So the reuse also has a cost associated with it, because if we put detergent down our sinks, we've got to then treat the water so it becomes potable again. And so everything from that systems perspective has a cost. Now, what we're not considering here is that this is a styrofoam cup that isn't going to degrade. And if you just throw that into the garbage and it ends up in a landfill, it's not going to sort of have a circular lifestyle, right? It's going to be stuck, it's going to be persistent. And so the challenge here is to develop things that are both energy efficient and that we can deal with in a different way, either through recycling or through other means.
And that's the flaw with the styrofoam cup, is that it doesn't currently have that onward pathway.
Well, it's not that there isn't a pathway, it's that the current governments and recyclers and systems haven't sort of developed a value chain to get value from that waste so that they don't use it. Not that it's not possible.
It's interesting because I've started this conversation by asking, about chemistry. We've had a little bit of chemistry, but also we've quickly broadened that out into, things that are less chemical. And actually, we had a speaker, from the launch party of the DIF, Liz Corbin from a Material Innovation Lab, and she said that the problem with the plastics are miraculous, actually, and the problem with plastics is not a material one, but a socio-economic one. Is that something that you would be on board with?
Yeah, I do think that is partially true. I think fundamentally we also have, which I know other people have spoken about, we have a design problem. And we have some of these materials in the wrong places, and we don't have effective recovery systems or technology to process them. And that's partly because of the economic situation where we don't value them. Plastics are incredibly cheap in the grand scheme of things. And so it tends to be far cheaper to just create new plastics than to collect, sort, process those molecules and make new materials again.
So is the problem that they're too cheap? Because it seems like a good thing that they're cheap.
Cheap is a good thing, I think, in the economy, lowering the overall expense of products. And I think Mike Shaver brings up a great point, which is we ought to be careful about demonizing plastics writ large, because they offer tremendous benefits to the economy, to the products that we make, use, buy, sell, trade. And so those kinds of benefits are often, let's say, some of the consequences of the systems design issues that we have tend to overshadow the tremendous benefits that plastics bring. And so I do think that there is an opportunity to invest in new technology to reprocess those molecules, not necessarily needing to raise the cost of them in the economy.
So what's the balance between the technical sort of this is, I mean, you work in a materials laboratory, so you're constantly playing with materials, and we'll talk about that in a bit, I guess. But what's the balance between the sort of material science and the how it actually engages with the world around it?
So I mean, I think that the complexity comes from the idea of a supply chain, right? Where you're really talking about the reason behind the inexpensive cost of, I like inexpensive better than cheap, the inexpensive cost of plastics being around our obsession with fuels, right? I mean, this is from the petroleum industry, and it's probably one of the most efficient processes on the planet, if not the most efficient. It's a ridiculously efficient system in order to separate all of those molecules out, break them down, and take as much value as possible from that resource, right? Because it is finite. And so once that process starts with that petroleum cracking, you now have these supply chain issues where you have supplier one that's going to be making the material, supplier two that's going to be processing it, three is probably a company that is developing a packaging solution. And so the public has a tendency to blame this on, you know, the grocery store or the Procter and Gamble's of the world that are using those in the packaging materials. But the complexity really comes from that understanding of that whole supply chain. And materials, the nature of the materials is really that early part of it. And that's really what has to get addressed with innovation. But it has to be worked out with the supply chain to actually make it onto store shelves.
So is that, Mike Werner, is that what you meant by saying that we have a fundamental design problem with plastics, that actually the chemistry that we're creating at the beginning of the supply chain has this sort of causation effect throughout the rest of the system?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that it is very difficult for product manufacturers to make products that fit within the existing recycling streams. For example, we can't make every product out of paper, which is probably one of the largest by mass materials that flows through the economy and through recycling infrastructure. We're certainly not going to make everything out of polyester, out of PET. And so it becomes, I think for those kinds of companies that are looking to do the right thing to contribute to better end-of-life outcomes for products, they really have to start asking themselves about the materials that are going into their products and how do those fit within a circular economy, but more importantly, what are the systems, what does the systems design look like, what kinds of technology can be deployed to really start closing the loops on those molecules and getting them back in, as opposed to putting them into a speed bump or into your roads or at a waste-to-energy facility and into our air.
You were nodding vigorously along with that. That resonates obviously with your experiences?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that there's a lot more creative. So, you know, a lot of the innovation is happening on what we would call the monomer side of things, right? Those are the small molecules that we're stringing together to make a polymer. But the
monomer and a polymer.
Oh yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
you can think of that as you have a pearl, right? And so you go home to your girlfriend or your boyfriend and give them a pearl, and they think that you're an awkward guy, and maybe you are. I don't know. We just met. But you string those together, and eventually that's long enough that the properties change. And so mono, sort of Latin for one, and poly, Latin for many. You string those molecules together to be able to get a polymer. And really it's the transformation of the nature of the material that gets us to those
So a polymer is PET a polymer?
Yeah, PET is a polymer. Yeah. So PET stands for polyethylene terephthalate. And so the poly is just indicating that's a polymer of two esoteric molecules, ethylene terephthalate. I've literally no idea what.
Well, you were saying a lot of the innovation's happening before that polymer.
Oh yeah,
ends.
so you think about, we're going to get to dissociate ourselves from petroleum resources, start using more renewables. But I think what Mike W. is pointing to is a real need to think about how to get value out of the end of life, right? And I wholeheartedly agree. Grinding that up and putting it into a speed bump or burning it for energy is not the smartest way we can do that. We've got to think about ways to break that down at a molecular level or sort of creatively get value from that waste. But the scale of that problem is really huge. So it needs to be done with a real buy-in from all members of that supply chain.
You know, our work at the McCarthy Foundation on New Plastic Economy gives some indication of the scale of that problem. You know, it's only 14% of all plastic packaging is even collected for recycling. 2% of that is actually recycled in a sort of same value level of recycling, and a third of it is just completely escaping collection systems altogether. Where are the areas where innovation towards, say, a circular economy for plastics would be really valuable, Mike Werner?
Yeah, great question. Just a quick comment. The optimism that I have is that I think we're at the tipping point of a revolution in recycling technologies, particularly given the stance that China took last year to restrict the contamination in recyclable materials that most of the Western world and developed world have been sending them. And that has forced us to deal with our own problems where we're, by human nature, and I'll speak from North America, fairly lazy when it comes to recycling materials. So we have this evolution in a single stream recycling infrastructure, and most people treat it like it is your average waste or garbage bin. And these municipal systems absolutely were never designed to deal with that, and are now having to cope and figure out, okay, how do we do this smarter? So I think that there are probably three different areas of innovation. The first is definitely in the collection and sorting of materials. So I don't think we should fool ourselves. We're not going to have bespoke collection streams for every individual type of product or material. And so we really need to try to find a way of dealing with the complexity of the world around us. And I do think that there are opportunities with either novel optical sorting or others local systems that might be able to process these materials in a much more efficient way.
Novel optical sorting, is that this idea that there's lots of different types of plastics, and in some way technologies will be able to sort of identify that's a plastic bottle, that's some other type of plastic?
That's right. That effectively shining light through these different types of materials will give off different different signals, and that will tell an instrument or a machine how to either divert that material or send it along into a further refined process. That's the basic idea. Probably two other areas, including chemical recycling, so that the breakdown of bonds or the solvent purification or solvent cleaning of some of these materials in a way to retain the value of those existing bonds. There's quite a bit of exciting new work happening there. And then the third is probably at a policy level. I think that there is an opportunity to implement policy that helps incentivize these kinds of technologies, much in the same way that renewable energy had seen a revolution in the last 10 to 15 years. And it's cheaper in the United States in most markets. Renewable energy is cheaper in most markets than that of coal, for example. And so I think because of the leadership of a lot of companies, including Google and others that have committed to 100% renewable energy, we could also see a revolution of leadership companies investing in the end of life of products and materials.
And maybe a question for you, Mike Shaver, is chemical recycling versus recycling?
So I think so when we think of a traditional recycling, what we're doing is reprocessing the material, right? So we have done our sorting, and I really like that bringing up the modern optical ones. There's a lot of different ways to sort because we don't have to depend on the chemical nature of the material. You can actually embed small molecules into those plastics and sort based on original use. So this bottle had water in it, so we can put water in it again. But that I think probably the biggest growth area is going to be in coming up with new ways to recycle things. So a traditional recycling process, a physical recycling, if you will, would be reprocessing. So I'm not breaking down any of my molecular chains. I'm just unentangling them. I'm taking my Christmas lights out of the box, pulling those apart until I now can mold those into a new form, right? But a chemical process is going to be fundamentally different because I had mentioned those monomers before. What I do is I have a polymerization process. I'm building up my molecule to make it, right? And I reverse that reaction and I depolymerize. And so I'm cutting the string that's holding my string of pearls together. I get those original pearls back, right? And those are the valuable components. I then can take those, make that material again, and have exactly the same properties. I don't have any loss of properties, either in the quality, the feel of that plastic, or whether or not it's becoming more brittle, or whether or not it's really nice to look at still, which is probably the biggest problem. All of those things are possible by going through a chemical depolymerization process. But that's difficult to do, and you need to have a scale that's large enough and sort of distributed enough that you can really do that.
I was going to say, it sounds like that process of de-chemistrying something might be more expensive and difficult than chopping the strings on your pearl necklace.
But the key is that you actually do get value out of it, right? So I think the recycling systems now, you're always losing value. And so because there's not then a lot of value in the waste, it's then difficult for municipalities to go and collect that well and to really collect a lot of it. And so you see big variation in terms of different regions and how much they collect and how they actually deal with that waste. Once there's more value in that waste stream, the plastic bottle becomes more expensive. And so, perhaps this is paired with a deposit scheme or something legislative that works well, but if your bottle is more valuable, well, you'll pay more for that, but you're really renting it because then it's collected well, we handle that well, we depolymerize that, or we break the bonds associated with it, and then make that up again and have real value. That's the circularity.
And so, for our audience who have maybe watched Blue Planet and they've said, they may have two reactions. The first one, I'm not using plastics anymore, plastics are terrible, which hopefully we've convinced them not. But the second response they might have is, this sounds hard. Isn't there something better that we can use? And is that some of the work you're doing at Green Materials in your materials laboratory?
So we have a number of inventions that I think that would fit into either of those narratives. So we have one, new polymer system that does this chemical depolymerization. We have it catalyzed, so we don't need to really add in any extra chemicals. It happens in a very clean way. There's a number of systems which are developed actually by some American chemists which work really well and do a thermal process where you can heat it up and do a depolymerization. All those things are great, but those are being done on a laboratory scale. And so while we have some partners that are interested in it, it's a challenge because most of those partners are at the same sort of technology level as Google, right? This is an end user of plastic. And you've got to be able to, again, bridge that supply chain well by have chemical manufacturers able to scale this up. The size of the plastic problem is so immense that you really do have to have these materials produced on tons and tons and tons very, very quickly to be able to really address the problem. And it has to be coupled to the socioeconomic changes that you mentioned earlier.
Are you saying that it's extremely difficult to take something you're creating in the lab that you can prove works in the lab and take it to the market?
Yeah, I think that is one of the hardest things as an academic. If you're really pushing the boundaries of innovation, it's quite straightforward to get to the level where you can show that something works, the pilot stage. To then translate that technology to a much grander scale, to a much larger scale, is very difficult. And that's especially true in chemistry because you've got very different reactions that are done on a small scale in your own laboratory, and probably 3 different stages of scaling that up until it becomes truly meaningful. And that's, of course, very different if you work in a specialist field like medicine or something like that. But if you're talking about plastic packaging, the problem is so big that you've really got to attach massive scales to this to make it work.
So, I mean, talking about scale, we've actually had a question in from Jeff for you, Mike. Is why have we got someone working at Google on a diff session talking about plastics? Why are Google interested in plastics? I assume he's thinking that he associates Google as the search engine primarily, or the online company primarily.
Oh, great question. So Google's actually gone through a very interesting transition in history as a company. I think when it comes to plastics, we have to think about a lot of things. We have first an enormous real estate footprint. And I am borrowing an analogy from my counterpart leading sustainability in our real estate organization, that Google is the world's largest hermit crab. We move into other people's shells, and we end up tearing out office space and putting new stuff in, and having to manage the life cycle inventory of a massive global office footprint. So Google has a rich history of addressing sustainability in the built environment. And plastics are used all over the place in thousands and thousands of products, everything from carpet to furniture, wall decoration, ceiling tiles, fixtures, cable, jacketing, you name it. And so there is definitely interest in understanding how can we improve end of life outcomes in that space. I sit in consumer hardware. And just about 3 years ago, Google launched in earnest a very large, or probably the largest, the most well-funded startup on the planet, 3-year-old making consumer hardware now. So I lead safer chemistry and product sustainability in the consumer hardware division, where we also have to understand, now that we're making stuff, what are the life cycle impacts associated with that operation? And how do we improve the end-of-life outcomes for our products into the future?
So so plastics are a material that touches such a huge range of sectors and industries. We've got lots of great questions coming in. Just to remind you that you can ask those on the thinkdiff.co page, on the YouTube page, and also using hashtag thinkdiff. Questions in about legislation, about oil prices. We've got a couple that might just challenge the mics, but we're still looking for that one that's going to stump them. So just to give you a little bit of time to think of those, and also for the mics to prepare themselves, my colleague Leo is going to give us a little heads up on what else is coming up at the Diff.
Hi, my name is Leo, and here's a little taster of things to come at the Diff. While this session is the last live session of the day, we're back in the live studio tomorrow at 1 p.m. to hear from the new Plastics Economy team here at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. In this session, closing the loop on plastic packaging, where are we? The new Plastics Economy team provide an overview of the NPEC initiative and reveal why we might be right at the tipping point in the transition to a circular economy for plastics. And if you're enjoying this session at the moment, make sure to check out the recording of the on-air session that took place on the 13th of November, titled, Can Data Help Design Out Plastic Pollution in Asia? Hear how building a waste data bank is a crucial step towards enabling the crafting of more effective design and ultimately creating a better plastics economy for the world's largest continent. And just to remind you all that there are close to 100 pieces of content up on the thinkdiff.co schedule. On the 15th, we released System Reset, an exclusive feature-length documentary produced by our very own Diff team. Leading thinkers in materials, economics, the commons movement, digital citizenship, fab labs, urban planning and architecture weave a picture of how our economy could operate to be fit for the 21st century. And that's all from me. Back to you in the studio.
So as Leo says, there's a huge amount of content at this year's Diff about plastics. Highly recommend that session on November 20th, of course, at 1 o'clock GMT. It's an issue that's capturing people's imagination, and has certainly been capturing the imagination of our online audience who've been feeding through the questions, which we're going to get to in just a moment. There's one other thing I just want to throw in the mix, because it's a big theme at this year's Diff, and perhaps it's one for you to start with, Mike Werner, is the issue of localized materials. So we've had a number of speakers talking about how, and actually the documentary that Leo mentioned, System Reset, touches on this, that how sourcing local materials and producing things locally could be an economic answer, that socio-economic side. Is that realistic for plastics though?
Good question. I think the simple answer is probably not. And I think if we consider the high technology, high physical resources, plants, infrastructure needed to make plastics and materials at scale, um, I don't see a local solution as being the panacea. Now, it certainly could be a spoke of a solution, but I think we could probably look more toward the local food movement for some signals there, where I think there definitely is community engagement and support of local industries and local infrastructure, but it's certainly not possible today to get all of your chemistry needs out of your backyard when it comes to high performing products at scale. So I'm not optimistic that that would be a viable long-term solution, but I definitely think that there are opportunities as a spoke of the strategy.
Any hope for our hybrid 3D printing makers creating plastic products, Mike?
Well, so I think if we come back to what Mike Werner originally was talking about in terms of that chemical depolymerization, I think you have a very large circle that stretches well beyond local. That's going to be that initial manufacture. You've got to be able to do that at a large enough scale with proper infrastructure to do that. There are some depolymerization technologies that breaking those down into the original units, which could be done more locally. And so there would be some plastics where you probably could, and maybe that's not truly local, but that could be UK wide or Greater Manchester, some subset of the world where you can do depolymerization, repolymerization, and get some circularity from that. But at every single step, you're always going to have loss. So it's never going to be truly circular, never going to be truly closed loop, but neither is any material that you're going to use for the same purpose. Each of those would cost more energy to try and do the same performance.
I never thought...
If I may,
go.
I'd love to build off of that because I really do like that idea of a local recycling or depolymerization potential. One of the things that I had met with a chemical company in 2008 that they have a coal gasification plant, and you might remember oil had just come down for about $140 a barrel. And I said to them, why don't you take post-consumer plastic waste and put it into your coal gasification plant? Because they made 30% of their monomers through coal gasification. And they said, you know what, we love that idea. We've talked about it many times. But we just can't solve for the transportation piece. It's just very, very expensive to transport the volumes that are needed. And considering how much volume plastics, post-consumer recycled plastics take up, they just couldn't make the economics work. And so there are some companies that are exactly doing what Michael Shaver said, focusing on a local physical process where recyclers in community could, for example, use a catalytic process to cleave bonds in polyester and olefins to form simple organic acids, which then could be transported on in a denser way to upstream to a plant that could then cascade those down into other materials. Adipic acid is an example which could go into nylon. But I do think that there is an opportunity for a local approach to chemical recycling.
So localized chemical recycling. I have to say, I never thought I'd been in a conversation where the words depolymerization and repolymerization were said so often, and I would sort of think I was following along with it. Obviously, that's only a judgment. But so we've had a couple of questions about polymers, which I'm definitely not qualified to answer. Maybe a chemist from Claude here. So. She asks, and if I ask you this one first, Michael Shaver, is it actually realistic to be able to break down the polymer chains? When you say it would need a big operation, in quotation marks, can you give an idea of what we are talking about? How big is big, and could every country, for example, realistically do it?
Oh yeah, certainly. So I think what you have to do is you have to design the polymer itself well. Theoretically, any system is going to be able to be depolymerized, but you want to be able to do that in an energy efficient way. All of the really efficient materials are based on either carbonates or esters. And so those are two functional groups, two types of molecules where you have bonds that are a little bit easier to break than other systems. And so you build that ability to break it down into the actual formation of the material itself. And this is why it comes back to that first question you asked. Why is the chemistry important? Because you have to design that into the system. You can't just take any system and expect it to do exactly what you want it to do. We have to be designing systems not only for the performance of the material itself, but also for how we actually use that afterwards. And with that design component, it's very straightforward. It's a very simple reaction to do. Where that becomes a challenge is in infrastructure. How do you collect the material? How do you sort the material? How do you do that depolymerization? And how do you break that down? And then how do you reform that? Each one of those is a chemically distinct process, but each one of them needs an engineering design to it to ensure that it's as efficient as possible.
So this isn't a case, I mean, obviously when we talk about design in this instance, it's slightly different kind of design than, I don't know, I'm going to design a chair, for example. But it's not a case of some bad chemists who just don't think about what's going to happen to the material after they've designed it.
Oh, certainly. So, I mean, that is, I mean, the reason that we have the plastics problem is because they are so ridiculously easy to make, right? And because they're easy to make, we think about the making predominantly. And I think green chemistry, which is a passion of both Mike's that you're listening to today, that is really thinking about the entirety of the life cycle. So instead of just thinking about the making process, we need to be thinking about what happens to it afterwards and what the source of it is at the beginning. So a holistic approach to chemistry. And that is, as we've already talked about, this is the tipping point we're going through right now. And I think green chemistry, it happened a few years ago, and now that is happening in materials and in plastics in particular.
So, I mean, the perspective you're bringing to Google, Mike, is that by combining, well, maybe this is a question actually, is the perspective you're bringing to Google that by combining some of this chemistry, some of this material science, with the scale of an organization, joining up some of that chain, is that where the sort of magic happens in terms of delivering good, positive innovation?
Well, I think with a key focus of Google is particularly having been a global partner of EMF and the circular economy for many years, safe and circular are two extremely important foci. On the safer chemistry side, helping address the safety of products and the safety of the materials that we're putting out into the world is probably step number one. And that in and of itself, we could have a whole nother session on talking about chemical hazard assessments and working through the supply chain to help understand toxicity and change the toxicity of materials. When we think about circularity, we're thinking about everything from what goes into our products, how our products are designed, what products we're consuming, certainly in the built environment, and then where those products go. And having leadership and banding together with leadership companies, particularly those in the CE 100, is a proven recipe for success. When the private sector bands together to address systemic change, I believe great things can happen.
So we've got sort of a question in from Mark Young that touches on this topic. He says, I think the general public have clicked that what we've been making and using is basically indestructible. It's accumulating everywhere and is not compatible with the planet or the environment. So his question is, in the chemistry world, are the majority of chemists thinking about about end of life now, or are they still more excited by making new compounds? Is that the distinction between green chemistry and other kinds of chemistry?
I mean, so I think you have probably two perspectives. You've got an academic perspective, and then you have industry, right? I think the chemical industry today is predominantly thinking about how to make money. And that's okay because they're companies and Google needs to make money. These chemical companies need to make money. But I think what the sense is now is that because of the real change in public perception around this issue and the real change in a true, I would say, market pull from companies like Google, there is now a real push from a materials perspective to become more sustainable. That it's almost a requirement now. They know that they need to change in response to this. And I think that's great to see. So someone who's been working in this field as an academic for many years, this really does feel like now the bulk of people are on board as chemists that this has to change. And I think it will, with the backing of good academic practice, good innovation from the science side of things, and companies who are on board with trying out these innovations.
Talking about, I guess, companies, there's a question from Sandy Mike Show that says, actually maybe this is a question for both speakers. What do our guests make of the polluter pays principle for plastics? Is that something you'd like to see if polluter pays was introduced for plastic packaging? Would that be a positive change?
I think first of all, what's your definition of polluter, right? I think that's a real challenge in terms of this. Is the polluter the home user that didn't follow the stated recycling guidelines properly, potentially because they were extremely confusing? Is the polluter the company that put out some single-use packaging, or is the polluter the company that made the plastic packaging in the first place and didn't design it to degrade? I think each one of those has a real responsibility. But what I do think is necessary is to have a clear definition of responsibility. I think the polluter pays is often applied to like deposit schemes where you're going to have to pay for this plastic bag and then that's going to encourage you to recycle that more. I think that's a rental scheme, right? And that's the best way to think about these plastics. We've got to attribute more value to them and we have to get more value from them. And that requires the public to participate in that, and it requires chemical companies to participate in that, and it requires government to participate.
And maybe on the topic of government, well, we've had a question from online from John. You have stated yourself as an optimist already in this session, which is fantastic. Hopefully that is well received. And he's asking about, is there anything specific going on legislation-wise that gives you cause for optimism? No.
Nothing that comes to mind right now. I guess when I reflect on it, I'm sort of struck by how government and the role of government has been to be the guardian, and how by and large around the world they've failed to fulfill that role, not because of the men and women who are dedicated to try to doing the right thing, what they believe is the right thing, and push for progressive change, but because of the nature of the system. And so what I think is encouraging is mostly looking at what's coming out of the private sector and the demand signals that companies are sending, the commitments that they're making to address these kinds of big challenges. That's where a lot of my optimism comes from. And we've seen not government really driving toward renewable energy by and large, but the private sector taking this on as a challenge, understanding that it's the right thing to do, and making billions of dollars in investments either in new installations, in additionality, or corporate policies to source from 100% renewable energy. And I just use that as one example, but I do think that there is a momentum building around safe and circular topics.
So demand from that side of the market is good because it sparks innovation at the chemistry level, but it also sparks innovation in the whole system, which deals with the sort of socio-economic aspect of what we're talking about, which is just as critical. Mike,
I think it is actually important to say that there is much more movement on the legislation front in the United Kingdom. So not to like boost your homeland, but
please, we take
fine.
anything we can get.
So since being here in the UK, it does feel like there's, I think, in response to Blue Planet 2, much more legislative pressure. There's a number of different funding initiatives where the government is putting in resource and bringing industry together with innovators across the supply chain to be able to try and make these breakthroughs. And so I would say the UK should get some credit for over the past 12 months, and I think continuing into the future, really making an investment in saying this is a problem that we want to solve.
We're pretty much out of time. I have one final question, although I'm going to ask, just before we went on air, Mike, you revealed to me that you are moving into material science in your new role.
Right.
So you're leaving chemistry behind after we've just said how crucial it is to everything.
I probably will still do some chemistry.
Why are you excited about that sort of shift?
So I'm moving to the School of Materials at the University of Manchester. And I think what that offers is it offers a very different sense of scale. So I talked before about that difficulty to really get from an academic lab into an industrial setting. And I think that the School of Materials offers a lot of different opportunities to valorize the academic research that we do. And so I think the timing is right, both in terms of the UK's sort of renewed focus on sustainability in plastics, as well as the stage of my research that we really want to be able to go and build value from some of the innovations that we've made and some of the innovations that we have planned to make, to start to scale these things up, to scale this up and process ourselves and roll out solutions that hopefully companies like Google can try out in a few years' time.
So the final question for you both is if you could change one thing, what would you change to make the plastic system better? Maybe Mike Werner, if we start with you. What one thing would be most catalytic?
I think right now my focus is where I see the most energy, which is engaging in energy in the metaphorical sense, engaging in companies to really innovate in the way these kinds of materials are recycled. My hope is that we reach a future where we have nutrient management systems much like nature does, where you've got an ecosystem of technologies and ecosystems of participants that are breaking these molecules down and bringing them back up into higher orders, so that they can fall down through the stream, through the economy, into new products. So that's where most of my excitement and optimism comes from, because I see everything from biological solutions to catalytic to solvents, heat and thermal processes, and I'm seeing commitments from trade associations and various other chemical companies to take on this challenge. So that's where I would like to see more change happening and accelerating in that direction.
Company-driven innovation, and Mike.
So I'm actually going to pick something non-chemistry.
Oh wow!
I think that there's really simple things that we could do, either in a country like the UK or the US, or ideally globally, and that would be to simplify things. I think there's actually a lot of people who want to recycle and they want to treat their materials well, and they don't because they're confused. So my thing that I would love to happen tomorrow that I think would make a big change is for every single recycling bin to be the same color, the same style, the same indicators on it, and recycle the same things, right? And so we don't have this piecemeal approach to how we're dealing with materials, that there's a homogeneity to it, a similarity where people can really embrace and do the right thing with the materials that they're using, and then leave it to us, leave it to the chemists to figure out ways to valorize that, but really give the public the tools to be able to treat the materials that they're wanting to throw away well.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for joining us this evening or this morning, this afternoon, depending where you're tuning in from. So there you have it. Plastics are a miraculous material, and the challenges, unfortunately, are not as simple as we might like them to be. In fact, they are highly socio-economic as well as material-based, although hopefully you've enjoyed some of the chemistry that we've discussed in this session. Do tune in again during this year's DIF. Remember, tomorrow at 1 p.m. GMT, the new plastics economy team are joining us in the studio. So if you've had your appetite even whetted further for more plastics, 1 o'clock tomorrow GMT time. Thank you so much for your questions and feedback and comments. And thank you again both to Mike Shaver and Mike Werner for joining us. Remember to keep engaging using #ThinkDiff.